Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale Cadillac Gage V100 Armored car, also known as the M706. Since the last video update, a lot of progress has been made to the vehicle's suspension and to the vehicle's lower hull. We'll be going over all these modifications and additions in this video, so stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of stuff coming at you. Picking up right where we left off in the last video, if we can recall, the leaf springs were mounted to the lower hull, and this now brings us to the next leg of the build, which is the differential work. I went over in greater detail on what these differentials are and how they're made, and you can see the detailing found on these surfaces. Now, on these units here, with the way they were printed out, they do have their nice overall size and shape to them, but one weak point of these prints are some of the texturing, and this is commonplace for large-scale 3D prints like this. You'll notice we have this crosshatch type pattern found on these surfaces, and this is something that I'm going to address. On top of that, this unit here is going to then receive its turning knuckles and its crossbar in order to finish it off. For the one in the rear, this too is going to be getting some improvements made to the bottom surfaces here. And on this unit, another mod I'm going to have to make has to do with the leaf springs. You see, because the leaf springs are mounted on a more narrow platform compared to the way these units were designed, these mounting plates are going to have to be replaced and new units are going to have to be fitted into place. So let's go ahead and cut to the point where we start doing the conversion work. And here we have the front axle going through its detail modification and enhancement. Note, I'm currently tackling the texturing that was mentioned before, and this is just my red glazing and spot putty, and I smeared it onto the surface here, and once it cures I'll be able to polish it off with some sandpaper, thus making it nice and smooth. On the mounting plates here, the original printed on fasteners have been amputated, and in their place I'm going to be using real brass fasteners to really give the look that the U-shackles are actually threaded rods and are keeping everything secured in place. But more information on that is to come towards the end of this video. On the top portion here, I also added the texturing. Now, I'm not going to add the texturing towards this section over here because this is really going to be mostly encased underneath the lower hull transmission well, and also the texturing on this part here is actually pretty good, so I don't really need to have too much concern on this for this component. One modification I did make was I deleted the two printed on holes that we have on these two sections here. Let me grab the rear differential so I could compare and contrast the two. You see, on these two printings, there's a small little divot found on these two locations, and this divot was for the shock absorber assembly, which descends from the upper portion of the hull. Now, on the Hobby Boss kit, which these parts, again, are derived from, the Hobby Boss kit took a bit of a shortcut in how this piece is rendered, and they have the shock absorber directly plugging into this top portion here of the differential. Well, that's not really how it is on the real vehicle, and Hobby Boss basically phoned it in, or not phoned it in, but they have a small error on their kit because of that. Generally, on vehicles with the shock absorbers, they typically connect to this mounting plate that we have here. So because of this modification, and I'm going to be incorporating this on this build, this top hole here was no longer necessary, so it was deleted. It was filled in with some liquid resin, and then it was smoothed over and then is thoroughly entombed with the bodywork that's on the surface at the moment. These two small holes here are going to be kept because these are what connect or plug the differential into the leaf spring system, so of course these are going to be kept, and I'm going to clean them out once the putty fully sets so that the piece can re-snap into place like what we saw in the last video update. On the ends here we have the turning knuckles. All that I did to these parts here was I took some fine sandpaper and went over it with a few passes in a nice thorough manner in order to blend down and smooth out those little ridges which were left over from the printing process. The only reason why this was done was so that the wheel mount here just can slide on and pivot in place with a lot less effort. One thing I notice about this type of material here is that unlike the white nylon material, which has been seen on many of my other builds and other parts on the catalog, where those parts are really more or less abrasive resistant, and if you try sanding them down, you're going to need to take some time doing so. This material here is the opposite. It's actually more along the lines of traditional molded plastic, so sanding it down was a lot less of a chore compared to something like the other nylon material that are seen on the other parts. Like I said here, this middle section is not going to be altered in any way on this model, but what I am going to tweak is the drive shaft. The drive shaft itself is fine for what it is and what it's being used for, but when it comes to the texturing, you'll notice that the texturing on the top side here is a lot less coarse compared to the texturing here found on the bottom. Now, although again this is going to be mostly concealed inside of the lower hull, it's something that I just want to nick it in the butt right now before I progress further with the model. All I'm going to do to alleviate this here is I'm going to amputate the drive shaft here from the transmission and remount it, but inverted, so that the smooth section is pointing downward, which is the part that's going to be more visible on this piece. After that, I'm just going to wait for the putties to set, and then I'll be able to polish it all down. And after a little bit of Velcro grease, this is what I was able to accomplish on the front differential. You take the cover cap off, so you get to see exactly what was done. The texture, you notice, was covered up with the red putty. And you can see that I added these blisters to these top and lower sections that we have here. On the real units that I was studying, apparently there's either some kind of a mold line or a weld bead that's present on these parts, but from what I was able to determine, it looks to be a mold seam, because on the real units, of course, these are made from cast metal and they are hollow. In order to cast them hollow, you do have a mold that needs to be joined together. So more than likely, that's what it is. The mold seam was just, on this model here, just a piece of half-round stock from Plastruct. I went ahead and trimmed it to shape and then blended it in with the bodywork. It's important to point out that on the actual production units for these sections, these are going to be integrally found and printed on those sections, but more information on that is to come, of course. Another detailing that I added was this small little drainage plug here. This, of course, is something that is present on the real units, but was absent on the original printing. And I also added a little data plate detailing, which, of course, is another bit of equipment found on this section here. Aside from the main unit, here we have the top dome section, or I should say the bottom dome section. This is the printed unit that I showed before and was just polished to get it to the format that we have here. Here I have the original one, and hopefully this comes out on screen, but you can see that there are some print lines found on this piece. It's not really noticeable. It just kind of has that look and feel of some I used to call them as a kid fuzzy Christmas ornaments. If you know what I'm talking about, you'll get the reference. But basically, I just went ahead and smoothed over all these lines with some sandpaper, and that basically did the job. I also went ahead and replaced the center drainage hole here. This one was a unit that was integrally printed, and I improved it further by replacing it with a fastener, which better replicates the real unit. This unit here is going to go through the same exact modification, and you know what? I'm actually going to go ahead and walk you through the process in order to smooth out these scan lines to make it resemble the unit that I have here. To start with the procedure, what I need to first do is add some kind of an element to the surface which will help smooth over a lot of the ribs, and this will in turn aid with the sanding and polishing procedures. Now, like I said before, this unit here is printed actually pretty well, and so the lines aren't nearly as egregious as some other lower end prints that I've seen over the years. But I'm just going to go ahead and polish it even further. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to utilize just plain basic super glue. This I'm going to basically just apply it to the surface like you see here. You can add a good liberal amount, and then from here I'm just going to use my finger and I'm going to smear it onto the surface. Now yes, you will be getting super glue on your finger, and that is something that you're going to have to deal with because it gets a little weird, specifically when it hardens, but that's okay. And if you notice, I'm just smoothing this out. Now, some people are going to wonder, can you use a rubber glove for this? And the answer is actually no, because the super glue will bond to the rubber glove, and that'll bond to the surface of the piece, and it'll just cause some more headache. So you just use your finger, and then just deal with the super glue on your finger in a later date. When it comes to the smearing process, you note I'm going in a very uniformed manner. Just make sure you thoroughly coat over the entire surface of the piece. And once it is thoroughly coated, you can see exactly how much more improved the surface is looking already. Kind of has that Weber grill looking like appearance to it. You also want to make sure it doesn't pool up here in the corners. And there we have it. Alright, is at this point here, I'm going to set this aside and let the super glue dry completely. And then at that point, I can go ahead and start the polishing procedure. And if anyone's wondering how do you get super glue off your fingers, well, if you have a benchtop belt sander like this, just go over it a few passes, and voila, no more super glue on your fingertips. Okay, after a few minutes, the super glue sets, and you can see the surface of the dome now is much more improved. A large number of those ribs now have just been completely caked over. But from here, we're going to go ahead and improve it a little bit further. It's at this point now where I can start sanding it with some sandpaper. Now to sand it down further, I'm going to be using some sandpaper. 320 grit works fine for me. You could obviously use either wet or dry sanding, whichever way works best for you. However, to speed this along, I'm going to have the assistance from the lathe. Let me go ahead and get this thing put into the chuck and show you exactly how it's done. With the piece now mounted in the chuck and it's mounted nice and evenly, it's at this point where I can start the polishing procedure. To do this, I'm just going to take the sandpaper and just hold it on the surface here and just gradually go up and down without putting any force on it, letting the rotation of the lathe do its job. After a while, the piece is going to be sanded and polished smooth, which will then complete the procedure. When it comes to using this type of setup, you want to go at some moderately slower speeds because this material here, it has a similar property to polystyrene where that if it heats up, it's going to start melting on you. And with the super glue on the surface, it's not really something that you want to do. So with the slower speeds, this should mitigate this quite a bit. I'm also going to be using a little bit of water on the sandpaper to help with the coolant and also helps with the wet sanding as well. back on the table, you can see what the outcome was from the polishing. It looks a little discolored up here, but if you look at it in the light, or you should see that little sheen coming off of the surface, you'll see that the surface is very, very smooth, and it's exactly the consistency that we're looking for. Also, you can see that the ridge line here has also been cleaned up. From here, I'm going to now do two more procedures. The first is to clean up the inner ridge over here. There's a little bit of flash left over from the printing process, which is kind of funny to say. And I'm just going to square this off a little bit with a Dremel. And the next thing I'm going to do is to replace this printed on fastener over here with a fastener which better replicates the drainage plug found on the real unit. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take care of that. Well, with the dome now out of the way, I can now progress to the rear differential. The rear differential, just like with the one in the front, does have a coarser texture here found on the bottom section. And this is something I'm going to smooth away with basically the same procedure that I did on the one in the front. However, unlike the unit in the front where I retained the two plates here for the leaf spring mounts, as well as just keeping the standard slots here where it plugs into the leaf springs. For the one on the rear, I'm going to have to readjust this because, as we recall from the last video, on this model here, the leaf springs are mounted slightly closer to the midsection as they were originally intended found on this design. So because of that, these are going to have to go, and these are going to have to go, and new cutouts are going to need to be fabricated. But before I could go ahead and get those cut into the material, let me first go ahead and start with the cleanup procedure. Well, with the cavities now filled in with the resin, what I'm going to do now is, before I go ahead and improve it further with that little rigidity strip that I mentioned in the front differential, I'm just going to add a little bit of putty on here and sand it down prior to the second layer of putty. The reason is just so it fills this section a little bit more thoroughly. Even though it's pretty much flat, I can still feel a small little dip in this section over here where the resin filled in this cavity that I mentioned before. Ones on the top aren't too bad. Maybe I'll add a drop of putty on either of those, and the reason is so that I can square it off. Once the unit is fully squared off, then I could go ahead and add the strip and then its second coat, and then the whole unit will basically blend in absolutely seamlessly. Okay, now we play the waiting game. As soon as this material is fully set and dry, I could go ahead and hit it with some sandpaper, squaring it off, and then we could go and do the next step. Once the bodywork is concluded, it is at this point here where I need to mark and drill out the sections on the differential in order for the piece to fully seat onto the leaf springs. Now, needless to say, this is going to be a very important, precise calculation and alignment that needs to be exhibited by me, because this unit here in this configuration can be mismounted in one of two ways, or actually in both ways, depending on how the holes are drilled. The unit can either be mounted in cockeyed, where it's askew in this type of direction, or it can be misaligned in this type of a direction in a lateral format. Both of which are less than ideal, and both of which will have dire effects of the model's look once the suspension gets fully fleshed out. So it's at this point here where I really have to do the math properly in order to get this thing fully mounted appropriately. Now, the first indexing point I'm going to iron out is the lateral motion this way, as the yawing type motion is going to be fairly easily taken care of because of the way the unit needs to key and groove into the leaf springs. So this one here is the one that's more important. Now, luckily, I have a good indexing point in order to help align with this section over here, and that is where the original two mounting plates were found on the printing. You can see that now that they're deleted, it does give me a visual cue on exactly where the parts need to align. Now, I was able to carefully align the piece just by eyeballing it, but I'm going to go ahead and take some measurements with the tape measure just to make sure everything is ironed out where it needs to be. The camera, by the way, is positioned exactly where I was standing while doing the alignment process, so it should be, for better or for worse, exactly where the part is dead center, so hopefully on screen the unit looks like it is centralized. Okay, so let me just take some measurements. Now I'm measuring from the flat side here of the leaf spring out to the end here of the brake drum. And I'm getting, is that 2 3/8? Yeah, 2 3/8. All right, let's try it on the opposite side. 2 3/8. Okay, good, fantastic. So now that I know that the unit is properly aligned in that format, I'm going to carefully mark the lines that go in a vertical format, and that is where I can then iron out where the key needs to be cut into the differential on the reverse side. like you've just seen, I went ahead and milled out the cutouts for the leaf springs, and the differential just dropped directly in place without really any other problems. Let's do a quick visual check on its alignment. Okay. You can see that it settles directly into that little recess that's found on the leaf spring printing. That's also true for the opposite side. That's going to take care of the yaw aspect. And let's check the alignment 2 3/8. Okay. 2 3/8. Okay. This fella here is now aligned. Is at this point where I could do the fun stuff, which is add the extra detailing to the surfaces here, which will include the exact same mods that I mentioned before on the front differential. With the differentials now fully modified, this takes us to the components that we have here strewn out on the table. These are the remainder of the components required in order to get the suspension fully fleshed out. These components here are all 3D printed, but unlike the other components that I've mentioned in this video and in the videos that came out beforehand, where those products were outsourced by having another 3D printing service produce them, these parts here on the other hand are not. These are actually produced in-house by myself. Which means, you guessed it everyone, I have finally taken the plunge and purchased my first 3D printer. Now, of course, when it comes to 3D printing, I am a massive novice at this. So if anyone's watching this and seeing some of the ways I went to make the parts and are pulling your hair out of your head, you know, keep in mind, I literally just, this is actually with about a week of playing around with the machine and learning how to slice and all that stuff, just to get the parts that we have here on the table. I gotta say that when it comes to 3D printing, it is a in-depth field in its own right. It's just like, well, I found it very similar to, well, working with resin in, you know, when it comes to the learning curve, as well as the amount of mistakes you're gonna make at first, and also just the sheer amount of variations on how to configure something, how to set the table. I mean, it's in-depth, and it's one of those type of things where it's gonna be a trial and error type process. So, you know, bear with me here, but you're going to start seeing more of these components start being seen in all of my 1/6 scale build videos, because it's a great way for me to pre-test something prior to just taking the plunge and ordering something from a third-party supplier, which, you know, some cases I make a mistake here or I need to revise something there, and, you know, it's just a great way to spend more money. So with this way, I get to make and pre-test stuff before they go off to actual production. I'm pretty sure several people are going to ask what my setup is and, you know, which machine do I have. Well, in order to pick the machine, I actually did a little bit of homework I spent quite a while researching different machines that are on the market, the prices, the size of the prints that I could do with them, the materials that could work with them, and I watched actually quite a few YouTube review videos. So the machine that I settled on was an Ender 3, and for the slice program I'm using Cura, I believe it's called Cura. People who 3D print know exactly what I'm talking about. And even with the slice program, there are several options available, and I went through a few of them trying to figure out which one worked for me. I'm having some pretty good luck with Cura, and there are some pretty good tutorials out there on, you know, how to set the machine up and the parameters and all that, but that's out of scope of this video. So anyway, as for these parts here, like I said before, I'm going to be doing some more my own personal prints, but these here are not going to be for production. If anything, you can see the parts that are printed by myself purely being done for prototype stage. The machine does output some decent quality of parts, but just it's good enough for, again, like limited runs like what I'm doing here, but not for production units. For actual full production, I'm still comfortable with using an external supplier because they have their machines squared away, their materials squared away, and I just like the speed that they work at and the quality that they produce. So for a while now, I'm just going to be sticking with those for actual production units, but for some of my own personal builds, like, well, this guy over here, I'm going to be using my own prints. And also, some of these parts are not going to be added to the catalog because they are kind of specific for this particular build that I'm working on. So more information on that will probably come. But anyway, so here on the table, we have a large number of those parts that I mentioned before. Here we have the shock absorbers. These here are the shock absorber mounts that connect to the differentials. Over here we have the shock absorber wells for the rear wheel well area, and these guys over here are the shock absorber mounts that get secured to the front portion of the wheel well on this vehicle. Let's go ahead and bring the or I should say, let me go ahead and go over these parts in more depth now that I have the 9,000 foot view taken care of. Starting with the shock absorbers, these are printed in 2 halves, and the purpose of this is so that it allows me a good deal of adjustability. Depending on how the differentials fit to the leaf springs and how the shock absorber mounts fit onto the wheel well, I may have to either lengthen or shorten this setup that I have here in order to just get the appropriate height. If it's too long, well, I could just, you know, stretch it out like this, but if I need to bring it in closer, I could just turn these down on the lathe to a length which would allow the component to fit on better. But I think hopefully this set here should be at the appropriate height, but of course we'll see once it gets time for fitting. There are 4 shock absorbers found on the V100 Armored car, obviously 2 for the front and 2 for the rear. The units printed out pretty well. Actually, I want to say, for anyone who's getting into 3D printing, nothing feels as exciting as when you actually have the unit in print, and yeah, you will be sitting there kind of like looking at a microwave cook, just looking at the little machine go through, and when it comes out, and it comes out really well, you just feel so accomplished. It's one of those type of things. But anyway, the quality of the pieces were pretty good. There are some lines on them just from the printing method, and luckily this material here sands down very easily. The material, I believe, is PETG, if I'm not mistaken. If I am, I'll put it in the below section of this video. It's just a spool I got. I was recommended to purchase off of Amazon when I purchased the machine. The material worked pretty well, and it sands actually pretty smooth. This is just done with basic sandpaper. It's not like the white stuff that I typically use, where that stuff is actually abrasive resistant. This material here handles more like traditional plastic, so I could just sand and polish it down, and it's no different than working, well, with PVC or styrene or any other material that are generally used on my traditional builds. I want to say, though, that this material, it works really well, but it is definitely something that has some limitations. Namely, I found strength. This material, I have broken it a couple times, namely on these sections over here. I believe I dropped one of these on the table and it landed headfirst and snapped off at this joint, so I super glued it back in place. Luckily, the material does super glue together very well. It bonds extremely well to it, but it is on the more fragile end, so which is another reason why for production units I'm not going to really use this type of method. But again, for what I'm using it for, this should be perfectly suffice. And since the model has a static suspension, I'm not going to have to worry about this piece actually functioning or anything. From there, it takes to the rear wells, which were actually some of the first items that I successfully printed. Here we have the well area. See, on the V100 Armored car, the rear wheel well actually sticks out further from the side of the hull compared to the one on the front, and because of that, they need to have this well present in order for the shock absorber to mount to the differential. The well here is just something I threw up together in CAD, and here you can see the detailing on it. Note there does have some well bead detailing that I integrally printed on. The way it's designed, it has this little lip here, so I'm going to cut into the Lexan side, and this will allow me to then just slide this fella into place and then secure him in place with glues or possibly fasteners, but that remains to be seen. The pieces are designed to fit perfectly with my shocks, as you can see right here, and there is some adjustability to it, which is perfect, so it allows me some flexibility in order to secure this fella where he needs to be. There we go, hopefully I don't crack it. Excellent. And that now brings us to these 4 plates and these 2 mounts. These components are what connect the shock absorber to the differentials, and the 2 mounts themselves connect the shock absorbers to the front wheel well. The plates were necessary because, like I stated earlier on in this video, the differentials do not have any way of securing the shock absorbers to them. They were heavily influenced off of the Hobby Boss kit, and on that kit there is an inaccuracy on how the shock absorbers mount on. The real vehicle has this type of a setup where the plate that secures the differential to the leaf springs serve double duty and have this little peg that emerges out where the shock absorber then connects to. And it's a good thing, by the way, that I went ahead and made these pieces myself, because these here are not the first attempts at making these components. In fact, I actually tooled up these same exact parts earlier on, and I even went ahead and fitted them to the vehicle, only to find out that once the shock absorbers were made, I had an error with my dimensions, and the shock absorbers were not going to be able to mount to these units and the hull because of the way the hull was designed. So it actually saved me a bit of money that I went ahead and printed my own set as, again, a dry run, so to speak. These units here should be able to mount on without any problems. That was also true for these mounts. Now, I also wanted to take the opportunity to show what the mounts look like and how I print them. I know a lot of 3D printing gurus are just cringing at the fact right now that I'm using a raft in order for the pieces to be printed on, but again, from my limited experience here, I tried using the skirt method. Didn't really pan out too well. The parts tend to pop off my plate, so I checked. I gave the raft attempt a try after watching the tutorial, and it worked. So far for me, right now, as for the date of this video, the raft method seems to work. So, again, as for the parts, this is my second go-ahead. The first ones looked identical to this, were just a little bit shorter, and again, there was some fitment issues, so these ones here were printed in their place. These pieces here have their well beads integrally printed on. They look a little bit on the sloppier end, so chances are I might sand them off and just sculpt new ones out of epoxy, but that remains to be seen. Like I said before, once these pieces actually enter into full production, or I should say final production, the production units will be made out of that other material, which lends itself for better surface detailing. So, alright, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the wheel well insert on the rear section of the vehicle. I went ahead and took some careful measurements. The way I designed the part, like I stated before, is that you notice that there's this lip that emerges from the 2 side areas here of the well. The idea is that I can slide this in here, and these sections over here give me a really good a good location to add the adhesives, which will then bond to the Lexan panels that are found on the model. This, after looking at the model and seeing how I'm going to install it, may or may not work, so it's going to be interesting to see how it turns out. To amputate these sections, I went ahead and, of course, marked everything with a pencil. I carefully took some measurements with the ruler, and I double-checked exactly where the shock absorber area is by looking over the real photographs that I have from the computer, and also from the Squadron Walk-Around V100 Commando book, which, by the way, if you're scratch building any model, or if you're really seriously working on a build, even a 135, these walk-around books are absolutely priceless. They're kind of what I use on every single one of my builds. So that's partially some of the reasons why I'm able to get the level of detailing that you see on many of the tanks found on this channel. Anyway, with that quick shilling out of the way, let's go ahead and amputate these sections here that I have crossed out. Not bad. Not bad at all. With the rear inserts out of the way, the next and probably, hopefully, last modification I need to make to the lower hull involves this section here of what would be the left-hand wheel well. On the real V100 Armored car, there is a cutout in this location over here for the power steering equipment. Now, this detailing is absent on the Hobby Boss kit, and it's one of those things you have to watch out for when you're using a 1/35 scale kit as reference. So, luckily, I had several photographs and reference material of the real vehicle, so I was able to cobble together the detail in order to add this section over here. What I went ahead and did was I went into CAD, I created the actual insert, and I had it 3D printed on my Ender 3. Now, you'll notice that the unit is not fully printed. I kind of had a snafu when I was printing this. Partway through, actually looks like about 3/4 of the way through, the spool actually got tangled up and got stuck in the extruder, so it wasn't able to print the remainder of the locations. Now, normally this would be a problem, but for this case, it's actually a happy accident because on my CAD file, I actually had an error with the depth of this piece, and it was deeper than it really needed to be. As it turns out, with the depth that you see on this printed component, it's more than enough for the application at hand. Now, all I gotta do here is just trim away the raft area, and then I'll be able to make the cuts and get this fella mounted in place. Here you can see some of the equipment that's going to be fitted to the section here. This large hole here is where the large clevis is going to descend downward, and eventually it's going to make contact with the inner portion here of these turning knuckles, and that's actually how the unit links together. And then the clevis itself is connected in part with a hydraulic ram, which would be located in this section over here. And that hydraulic ram gives assistance to the clevis, thus giving you some more power in order to turn a vehicle of this weight. Here we have 4 mounting lugs. These are for a metal shield which will come over and protect the hydraulic ram from any sort of possible damage. Over here we have 2 more small holes. These are for hydraulic lines which will come out and make contact with the hydraulic ram. So now that I have all this explained, let me go ahead and start with the trimming and with the mounting procedure. the section now removed, I'm ready to install the new insert. But before I do, I'm going to take some plastic rectangle and just glue it along this top section here so it has a backstop so the piece can butt up against it. This will ensure that the piece sits in nice and flush in its appropriate manner, and will also give it some more added extra strength. Because the vehicle will have pivoting steering, this piece here really needs to be mounted on in a very secure manner just to prevent any sort of cracks or breakages that can possibly happen over time. Because, like I said before, this part will have to be connected to the differential, and so there is going to be some functionality and some pivoting going on in this section here, so this is definitely going to be required just to keep everything firmly in place, and again to prevent it from cracking as the model eventually ages. And just like I mentioned in the last video, when you're doing large-scale scratch building like this, plastic angle is going to be your best friend. So let me go ahead and just cut this little piece here. And there we go. Super glue this bad boy in place. Now I want to super glue it so that it is flush up against the top recess here that I cut into the plastic. There we go. I'm just going to let that sit and dry. There it is. Now you stay. All right, good boy. All right, now that that's mounted in place, I'm going to let it dry, and then I'm going to go ahead and mount the insert. All right, now that the internal braces have been added and the glues are basically set, give or take, from here I'm going to go ahead now and mount on the insert. So I'm just going to go and add a ton of glue to the appropriate locations. Alright, now that that thing is fully drenched, you're going to take the insert and literally, well, insert it. So, just line it up. Well, that's basically it. So, now I'm going to let the glues dry fully. Once done, I'm just going to go and take care of the bodywork like I did with the two on the rear. And here you can see the wheel well now starting to take shape. The unit, the glues have finally set in place, securing it to the intersection, and I just took some red putty, smeared around the edges, and currently waiting for it to set so I can polish it away. On the rear section over here, that's already been going through its process, and underneath this powdery mess, we have the section that has been smoothed away. So let me go ahead, clean this crap up, flip the vehicle over, and do the same thing to the opposite side. Well, with the sanding out of the way, you can see that the piece is now thoroughly blended into the remainder of the wheel well. From this point here, I can start designing and fitting on the remainder of the detail components and start stringing everything together. However, that information is going to be discussed in more detail in the next video update, so stay tuned for that when that video drops. And just like on the front, you can see how the rear inserts are now blended into their little wheel well cavities. And if I slip on the shock here, there you go, you can see exactly how everything looks once fully assembled. But again, just like with the front, this is going to be discussed in more depth in the next video update. Well, with the bodywork, the lower hull revisions, and these inserts now out of the way, this opens the door now for the addition of the added detailing. And that's what we have right over here. On the table, we have a mix of pre-production and actual production samples of the new V100 components. Just like with the other components that I mentioned in this video and in the other videos in this series, these pieces here are all made from 3D prints. Starting with this runner over here, this set is a production sample of the V100 Armored Car bump stop set. These are going to be fitted to this model momentarily, but here you get to see what they look like on their fret. The set contains 4 of these bump stops, where it contains the bump stop mounts and the actual bump stops themselves. With the runner in hand, you can see how the parts are all laid out. Here we have the main bases, which get secured to the vehicle, and then we have the bump stops, which are separate printing. The bump stops themselves have their appropriate geometry to them, and they also have their center fastener, which are found on the real units. Now you notice on this model here, they are just regular 3D print. I am on the fence of whether or not I'm going to possibly have these as an option or just produce them in a cast rubber format to give the model a little bit of an extra edge, but this is something that's really to be determined. At this point here for this build, I think I'm just going to stick with the static ones and just paint and weather them as I would normally do on any other model. From the bump stops, this now takes to the next set, which is the V100 Armored Car lower hull lift ring set. The V100 has 4 of these lift rings found on each of the 4 extremities on the lower hull. The set contains everything, and it's all self-contained, where we have the mounts themselves. Note they are pre-welded. We have the lift rings, and we have the lift ring fasteners. Now, this set here is a pre-production sample, and the production units will be slightly changed from this. Not so much with the design of the parts or their layout. That's going to stay the same, but what is going to change is the overall scale and size. This set here is slightly overscaled, so it's not going to be suitable for actual production use. For this model, I am going to keep and utilize the mounts because they are close enough for what I need them for, and I could just create and print new lift rings that are more to scale for this setup. The lift rings that are found on this runner are not going to go to waste. If anything, I'll probably just repurpose them, repaint them, and mount them on my 1/6 scale M3 Lee because the size and style of these are very similar to what you would see on that pattern of vehicle. From the lift rings takes us to the next set, and this here is a pre-production sample of the V100 lower hull drainage plug set. The drainage plugs are in 2 flavors on the V100 Armored Car. We have the versions here that are capped and the versions that are open. The open versions are for, I believe, the bilge pump system in order to pump any water that would get into the vehicle when it would be forwarding or doing any sort of amphibious type operations. If there any water gets on the inside, a bilge pump would pump that stuff out, and these pieces here would be the extremities where they would the wastewater would be jettisoned. The other ones are capped, and these are basically drainage plugs where you keep them in place normally, and then if you ever, for whatever reason, need to open them up to drain any residual water, you just take a wrench to these units here, and off you go draining any type of fluid that's on the inside. The units that you see here are printed by my Ender 3, and these are suitable for my build for seeing if, for scaling and other parameters, but the actual production units are going to be slightly different. First and foremost, the main difference on them is going to be that the production units will have their well-bead detailing already integrally printed on. For this model here, I'm going to be sculpting them the old-fashioned way, but for the production units, that's one last thing to worry about. So the fret for those will have that detailing already present. Well, here's the hull now with all of those bits of detailing now fitted. You can see how they really start fleshing out the bottom portion of this vehicle. At the moment, the front and rear differential as well as their shock absorber components are only on temporarily. This is just to give you the idea on how the components are all fitting together and how the lower suspension is fleshing out. After the filming of this video, I'm going to go ahead and take the suspension off for probably one last time so I could thoroughly paint and prime both the lower chassis as well as the front and rear differential components. Once everything is painted, then I can start with the permanent assembly and installation of these parts. But that information is going to be discussed in the next video update. But the story doesn't end there, because not only will the suspension be fully assembled, painted, and mounted to the vehicle, but the model will also be able to be sitting right side up for the first time. And the reason is quite simple, because I now have on hand all 4 tires and rims in order to fully outfit this vehicle. So stay tuned for that information in the next project update video. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale Cadillac Gage V100 Armored car. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this guy over here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, along with the other smaller and larger scale builds that are showcased on this channel. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Till next time, take care.